Thanks everyone for being with us today for SC&H Group's webinar, Best in Class Planning and Forecasting for Government Contractors. I'm Colin Kendall and I'll be your moderator for today. Before we get started, I'd like to share a few housekeeping items for today's presentation. All attendees will be on mute during the webinar, but please feel free to ask any questions throughout. There's a tab located at the top right of your screen where you can submit your questions along the way. And then we're going to dedicate the last 10 minutes or so of today's presentation to answering those questions. We will be following up today with a link of the recorded webinar so that, for any reason you need to hop out or you miss any of it and you want to listen back, you have the ability to do so. We'll have that out to you within the next 48 hours after the webinar. If you need any further information or have any additional questions afterwards, please feel free to contact Pritpal directly, and we'll provide his contact information. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenter for today, Pritpal Kalsi, Director at SC&H Group.
Thank you, Colin. Good afternoon and welcome everybody to today's webinar. Just to kind of set the stage, I want to give a quick overview of what to expect from the following 15-minute demonstration, and like Colin mentioned, and we will take any questions at the end of this presentation as well. I'll begin with a very quick overview of SC&H and BPM practice that specializes in Oracle EPM solutions that we're going to be focusing and doing a deep dive on today. We'll speak to our expertise in the government contracting industry, and then specifically how the Oracle EPM cloud solution has been leveraged for budgeting and forecasting within this industry. We are also going to be doing a live demonstration of the solution, specifically focusing on how to build up indirect rates for the industry. With that, let's get right into it. So SC&H is a full-service management consulting CPA audit firm, structured very much like the big four firms that you may be familiar with, Deloitte and PwC. There is a management consulting arm of SC&H. Within that, we have the BPM practice that focuses on budgeting and forecasting and close consolidation solutions. We are a Platinum and a Cloud Select partner with Oracle, and we've been in the business for over 18 years with more than 200 implementations specifically around enterprise planning and enterprise close consolidation. And one of the accolades that we take a lot of pride in is all of our implementations and projects are 100% success and 100% referenceable. With that, let's get into the current landscape of the industry and why it's important to have enterprise planning and forecasting solutions in the government contracting industry. I am sure all of you are very familiar with what's happening in the industry. The policy is continuously changing. This is nothing new. It just seems with each year fiscal policy changes, as a result, drives some actions on the government agencies and departments. What we're noticing in the industry today is that the government continues to seek deep long-term spending cuts. As a result, either they're just scaling back on initiatives or just not going forward with some of the initiatives that they had in mind. We're also seeing, as a result of this policy, a shift back towards more of a lowest bid mentality versus leveraging the best value that the government contractors may be able to provide to the government. As a result, the contractors have to respond to the changing fiscal policies, and it's important to strategize on how to expand on existing business. To fuel that, what we're finding in our experience is that the government contracting industry is leveraging two main strategies to stay current and fuel growth. One is just diversification, whether that be through client diversification and focusing on commercial markets and or geographic expansions. And another being transforming existing enterprise processes, specifically around the financial processes for measuring profitability and managing costs. Today's webinar is actually going to be focusing on strategy number 2, which is managing profitability and minimizing costs through efficient enterprise applications. So why should a government contractor invest energy in an enterprise budgeting and planning solution? Well, one of the key things that we see very commonly is that a lot of processes that exist today are so manual and so burdensome that a lot of the energy for the divisions and organization members that are contributing to the planning and forecasting cycles goes into the man effort and the manual assembly of the information that's important for the management to make management decisions. In order to have best-in-class solutions and processes, you need a tool that's designed to quickly assemble all of those low-value-add informations and present a consolidated view of financials such that the management is looking at forward-looking analysis in the quickest time possible. What we find as we embark on initiatives within our clients and prospects, specifically around budgeting and forecasting, is three main areas that they seek efficiency in. First one being reporting and analysis, second being process management, and third being compliant and having visibility into raw information that's being summarized on key financial metrics. Let's do a deep dive on each of these three. Focusing on reporting and analysis, some of the key things that jump out is having the ability to do real-time analysis for not only your costs and fully burdened costs, but also any extrapolation of revenue that's being built up by the drivers that you have in your process. As you're doing that, there's always the need to be able to look at these scenarios across multiple different iterations of your financials, whether that be your forecast versus actual, forecast versus your annual plan or budget, or your plan versus actual. And keep in mind, within this industry, there's specific nuances attached to the indirect rates. We're going to be talking a little bit about that as well. As you're also looking at your financial information, there's also the need to be able to quickly drill into the base activities that are driving components such as your project details, as I mentioned, being able to look at raw costs, but then also the costs associated through the burdening of those raw costs, having the ability to look at how organizations roll up into your various business segments, and once again, how rates impact your analysis there, being able to look at what components of your costs were allowable or unallowable, so you can look at your performance on a recovery basis, and then also being able to look at direct versus indirect expenses. Largely some high-level themes, but as you can appreciate, the notion of being able to build up raw details that you need at the core bottom level is important, so that when you're looking at summary information, you can always analyze and drill deep into the bottom level information. Another component is just to being able to do what-if analysis. This is very important to the industry just because there are multiple different activities in a given year that could trigger reorganizations, whether you have major acquisitions that require reorganizations and a recalculation of your indirect rates, or you may have an organization that has, as part of their strategy, an annual or a biannual process that goes through reorganizations just to be able to be competitive and leverage whatever efficiencies you want to take part of at different points during the cycle. You may also be embarking on restructuring around just how you build up your pools for indirect rates. Also having the ability to do what-if analysis around global drivers, such as changing merit percentages at a global scale for a selected division, or changing the timing of some of those assumptions. From a process management consideration, as is with most government contractors, you'll find yourself actually working across multiple planning cycles at any point in time. The common ones that come to mind are you will always have a component of your business that's working on estimating the current book of business. Not only are you estimating the current book of business, you may be actually looking at forecasting more from a financial extrapolation standpoint on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis. You may be even embarking in initiatives such as rolling 12 or rolling 18, and sometimes even longer durations. And you may actually also be going through your annual planning processes for the purposes of building up the budget, for provisional rates, so forth and so on. So the need comes from having a process that not only supports each iteration of each of these planning cycles, but supports it concurrently. You also need processes that allow users at different points in the organization to interact with the process. What we find very commonly is because the process can be so burdensome that limited users actually come into the buildup of the fiscal plan or budget, and it becomes a very manual Excel-based process facilitated through back and forth emailing of Excel spreadsheets, sometimes really, really large. So a process that is efficient is key, that not only gives the project managers the ability to layer in their assumptions, but it also gives the, I'll call it the the corporate division to layer in their assumptions so that you can look at your P&L and other financials holistically. The last component is extremely important in the industry just because everything is audited and you need the ability to be able to provide all of the backup that you use for building up your provisional rates and submission for approval. So the notion of having black boxes is not, the outcomes of having black boxes and not being able to justify the rates. The outcomes are bad, so we want to make sure that we avoid it. Not only that, like I said, when you are building up your plants, you want to have the audit trail so that when you're looking at a consolidated P&L by segment and evaluating your profitability or doing a deeper analysis on your costs, you want to have the ability to drill into projects. You want to have the ability to drill into not only just within the projects, but also what were the staffing assumptions that were built up that drove to that final result. So the audit trail for visibility, for analytics, and then also for compliance is critically important. So let's talk a little bit about how within this industry, the best-in-class planning solutions come together, leveraging Oracle's EPM Cloud as a platform. So as I go through the following set of slides, I'm actually going to be focusing on just to give a brief overview of what Oracle Enterprise Planning and Budgeting Cloud Service is. Some of you may heard of Oracle Hyperion Planning or Planning and Budgeting Cloud Service. I'll just clear up some of the nomenclature there so everybody understands what we're going to be looking at and how that's used within the government contracting industry. I will then actually get into some considerations to keep in mind as you're looking at enterprise planning and budgeting processes. We'll focus at a high level what some of those key considerations need to be, and then we'll also do some deep dives around good practices for project planning, then also labor planning, and we'll bring it all together as what a holistic end-to-end process may look like right before we get into a live demonstration. And as I mentioned earlier, we will be leveraging the indirect rates model as an example for our demonstration. So Oracle EPBCS, or Enterprise Planning and Budgeting Cloud Service, is a component within the Oracle EPM Cloud suite of products. It is a true cloud platform that's managed by Oracle, and it eliminates the need for any internal hardware requirements or IT overhead. It's a true platform that's pre-built to include components such as financial planning, including P&L planning, balance sheet, cash flow, with the ability to drill some of your financials by projects and then also by employee. There is a lot of pre-built content that aligns extremely well with the government contracting industry, and I'll be actually illustrating some of those components in a few minutes. We're also noticing that a lot of the government contractors are now embarking on going to the Oracle EPM Cloud because of Oracle's recent compliance that they've been able to get certified on, FedRAMP being one of them. I have a link at the bottom with all of the specific details across each of the products, but I just wanted to quickly highlight for the audience here that the Oracle EPM Cloud is very much a feasible product for the government contracting industry. As a result of the tight compliance requirements, Oracle actually now has all of the required compliance certifications. So let's get into some of the methodologies and considerations as you're looking at implementing an enterprise planning and budgeting process using Oracle EPM. The first point that I would like to make here is something that we've always talked to all of my clients, all of our prospects, is the notion of walk before you run approach. Within a government contracting industry planning process, there are a lot of detailed components that are required for accurately building up the P&Ls. Once again, naming and calling out the indirect rates process. And the original inclination is to actually go with the big bang approach. We recommend against it just because there's a lot of change management and adoption required to implement an enterprise process such as what we're going to be looking at today. And typically what we've recommended is a two-phase approach. First one focusing on your core financials, particularly the P&L by project and org and your accounts, and phase two focusing more on modeling of the indirect rates. There's a component of applying the burdens that's very well built into phase one, Indirect rates, the phase 2 specifically, is actually calculating the rates and then leveraging that as part of your business. Another key component that we really strive for is to give users who are responsible for managing the projects and managing the day-to-day operations. So if you're a project-based organization and you're managing a staff of 10 across your project, the process should be designed such that that project manager has the ability to staff their project across the team and then layer in those assumptions directly in the application so that there's no manual effort required for communicating back and forth between what is truly operation and what ultimately is required to extrapolate your financials, both from a cost and revenue perspective. Some guidelines and best practices. I'm sure the organizations are always familiar with their chart of account and their general ledger. So to the extent possible and feasible, you should look to align those structures. Once again, calling out specifically your accounts, orgs, any pool definitions that you may have in your source ledger systems. You should leverage hierarchies and attributes that give the ability to do analytics more beyond just capturing it at the bottom level of detail. So things like having org codes roll up to divisions or groups is a key best practice that we always look to. And same thing more from a segment and pool alignment as well. You should also be looking to model your process around the most detailed process. Specifically, what we find is the annual budgeting process is more detailed bottoms up, and you always want to design a process that can support the most detail, but should also be flexible to provide users and management the capability to do high-level strategic planning, the 3 to 5 year view quickly as well. So it should be flexible to handle both sets of information. We should also look to integrate any attributes, as I mentioned earlier. Some key things that jump out are project attributes such as start and end dates, contract types, for example, cost plus, time and material, fixed fee, so forth and such. And then also any attributes that be attached to an employee, such as the base the base organization or home office for each of the employees that are built up. Another component that we come across very commonly is just to determine the right level of detail for project planning. Typically what I find in the project tree is something along what is represented on the screen here with vehicle, contract, project / programs rolling, further built up by project types and tasks. What we typically recommend and strive for is that you really want to identify where it is that you're interested in looking at financial results of that project versus what's happening day to day more from an operational planning. And there is a fine line that you do want to draw between the two, just because if you have a process that's more designed for financial analysis, you do not want to have the burden of maintaining the detail that's required for the day-to-day operational planning. From me, so those were high-level considerations. As we get into some of the subsequent slides, we'll be focusing on key topics that are important to the industry, starting with project planning. So as I mentioned earlier, you really want to give your project managers the ability to interact with the process, but you also want to make sure that the process is standardized such that various groups, various segments that may have different businesses can use a standardized template to capture their activity required to build up a project cost and project revenue. Couple of key components that you should always have ability to support is direct and indirect labor, anything that you may be bringing in more from a subcontracted labor, any direct costs, including capturing, corporate related costs or namely indirect costs. And then as you build up your process that supports the bottom level detail by project, by org, by account, what you're actually doing is you're capturing the required information that is then used for burdening your projects to be able to do fully burdened project analysis. Another key component that I wanted to touch upon from a best practice standpoint is planning for labor. This comes up almost every single time we're designing a planning and budgeting process, and you may have an existing process that leverages individual name planning, and that's used for staffing, or you may have a FTE-based approach where all program analysts are planned for at a standardized global assumption with just a number of utilization, or also hybrid. We'll talk a little bit about how you can actually have the best of all three here, and how the system could be designed such that depending on the need for the detail, whether that be by individual employee, named employee, or by FTE, you have the flexibility in the process. Okay, so to set the stage of what we're going to be talking about, I want to quickly spend some time highlighting the flow of information in a normal budgeting and planning process. So what we're representing here in blue cubes is essentially different sets of data that's captured in the end-to-end planning and budgeting solution. Keep in mind, this is a fully matured process. My recommendations would be to take that phased approach as we had spoken about earlier, but let's go through this very quickly. Starting with financials in the center. The financials cube represents the summary cube that brings together all of your accounts, your orgs, and your project level of detail, but may not necessarily have the details attached to an individual employee. Where you would actually find that is in a combination of your project and labor cubes to the right of your financials. And as you can see, as represented with the arrows, the information is always flowing from one cube to another. Another important point I want to make here, even though these are individual cubes represented separately, the information across each of these cubes is actually real time, and it moves seamlessly. So an end user, when they're running the reports in that reports cube on the left, there is no notion of having to connect to financials or projects or something else. In a process where you have everything end-to-end integrated, it's almost seamless to the end user, and you can pull that information real time. There's also capital cube, typically we find for capital project planning or for detailed capital planning. We're not going to be going too deep into that, but we will be focusing on projects, labor, financials, and like I said, I will actually be doing a live demonstration of the indirect rates represented in the blue cube on the bottom right. Other things that are represented on this graph is basically data that's required for this budgeting and planning process, and we're bringing that information in a systematic integration as well. We'll revisit this picture after a couple of more deep dives within projects, labors, and indirect rates. So let's present some visuals, and notice that I'm going to be using Excel mockups to illustrate these concepts, and the reason for this is even though Oracle EPBCS has a lot of screens pre-built, some of these screens need to be specific to the government contracting industry. So I'm not necessarily going through an Oracle EPBCS overview. I'm focusing on the exceptions that are relevant to the government contracting industry. I spoke about a process that can leverage global drivers such that you don't necessarily have to maintain bottom level detail every step of the way. This is an illustration of using hours more from a standard hours that, you have the 2088 working hours in any given year, then being able to layer in assumptions for PTO, holidays specific to the organization, and any other adjustments you want to make to calculate productive hours. And then productive hours then become the global driver for all further calculations that need to be made at an employee level of detail. Merit increase, if this organization in this represented example has a 10% merit increase in November, you can apply that assumption at the global level of detail, and it's from that point. You can also layer in other assumptions such as any planned expense adjustments that you want to make at the global level. Once again, these are just illustrations of exceptions to the normal process that you would find for planning of P&L. Let's take a look at a few concepts that are applicable to government contracting industry when you're planning for a project. In this screen, what I'm going to be focusing on is just how you can actually build up by employee detail very quickly. And notice what we've done here. The gray cells for each of the rows represent pre-calculated hourly rate. You may have salary employees based on high-level assumptions and calculations. The system can actually calculate a predefined hourly rate with all of the appropriate adjustments already built in. And then if need be, if there are project specific adjustments that need to be made to the rate, you can layer that in as well. I'll call out some key themes from these visuals that we're looking at. For example, Paul Kim. Notice as we're building up this project staffing plan, we also have the org that this person is responsible for. This may not be something that a user needs to type in or select. It may very well be a byproduct of user's attribute, and the home org is represented there. Once you type in all of the information, you can also run information around percent utilization. So if you have a single employee allocated to multiple projects, you can see if they've been allocated 200%, which is obviously not feasible, and you can make appropriate adjustments if necessary. The key here is, as you're building up your staffing plan by project, you're always keeping the org relationship as well, which comes in handy when you ultimately need to apply the burdens. Next screen is talking a little bit about the FTE model. As I mentioned earlier, there are multiple ways to build up this plan, but keep in mind, if you do build more or less, what I find the common theme is a hybrid approach where you have by individual named person planning for staffing, but there's also the need for FTE planning. When you're seeding in your actuals, you can only seed in either through the FTE methodology or through by named employee, just to minimize any risk of double counting that information. And if you choose to do that, just be mindful that as you're building up your FTE, once again, you need the appropriate segment or combinations for burdening, but then also going forward, everything is planned more on an FTE basis versus individual employee. If you look at the output of all of those calculations in a hybrid world, what you'll find is by project actuals, we're looking at a representation screen which represents a forecast of actuals through actuals through September, and October through June are the forecasted open months. If you have both capabilities in the labor planning, the actuals are only seeded with one view where FTE is represented as blank. So kind of tying it all together, once you have a project and you've built up various components of the cost, you also want to make sure that you have the schedule of rates. You can have multiple versions of your schedule of rates. You can have forecast rates. You can have provisional rates. You may even have what-if rates that ultimately, based on the activity that you're building up, could be burdened to give you the full cost of a project or a part of business, and then you can look at the profitability as well. There's also, this once again just represents a method to capture the schedule, but you can adopt different flavors of this. The notion of having more than one rate is the key that I wanted to illustrate with this screen. If you have another component of being able to build up not only just the project cost, but also any cost center or direct business overhead indirect costs, there will always be the need to just simply manually input data. The solution supports that very well, where if you have a chart of accounts, as illustrated with some examples in the rows here, you can have a screen where actuals, where possible, are seeded as a reference, and then any future months that you need to plan for are visible and available to a user to come in and input. There's some interesting functionality that you could also benefit from, where you can actually plan for summary quarters and year totals as well. We'll talk about that in a little bit. If you follow this methodology, what this allows you to do is then calculate behind the scenes using business logic in the application, the burden components of your project. So what I'm representing here in the orange cells are calculated expenses that have been burdened on the base activity to give you the total project cost, which can then be layered in with any assumptions you have for revenue, illustrated here with a cost plus example. You may have fee percentages across various components of your project. Once you appropriately apply that fee, it actually calculates the revenue for you. And keep in mind, the yellow cells are the only inputs. The rest is system generated or leveraged based on attributes or analytics that have been defined globally in the model. So the maintenance for a project on a go-forward basis is minimized as the system allows for efficiencies to calculate it. Another nuance that I've seen come up more and more, actually this was a byproduct of the fiscal policy a couple of years ago, where there were strict guidance around executive salaries and how, projects that had been funded needed to be captured more from a high-low fringe package for executives needed to be accounted for. And the way we've guided our clients on accommodating that is having the ability to do project-specific overrides, very simply, where you can come in and override any of the rates that may be a component of the negotiation as part of the contract or a result of changing policy. A couple of other, notions that I wanted to make sure we touched upon is also have, within the industry, very commonly you have, contracts that span beyond one fiscal year, and you may have multiple years worth of options within each of the contracts, and you may even have different points of the contract that trigger a recompete instead of actually building the assumptions bottoms up with the percentage win probability. The system could be configured such that you can classify a project by band. In this example, we're looking at an existing project that's up for recompete beginning January forward, with a 40% probability of the organization actually having that business going forward. What the system can then do is use those drivers to not only give you the total projected revenue and cost, but appropriately calculate the adjustments that need to be made to back out the 60% of the business that essentially is applying the risk associated with the fact that the project is up for a recompete beginning January. Another component that I wanted to quickly highlight was having the ability to take anything that you're doing from a sales perspective, particularly around bidding and proposal projects. You can use the tool to capture that activity, and you can start planning for potential revenue and costs for the P&L purposes using, once again, drivers that trigger those calculations. In this screen, what I'm representing is a BMP project that we would like to include for revenue and cost calculations effective January forward, because we, at this point, believe, even though this is a proposal project, it will be revenue and financial generating project, and rather than rebuilding it with a separate project, we can simply convert this project into something that drives your P&L calculations. Okay, kind of coming back to this picture, and like I said, the next section we're actually going to get into the live demonstration. I talked a little bit about how your projects could be set up for planning and forecasting, some of the nuances specific to the industry, what considerations you may want to incorporate as you're implementing that process, and then also around labor planning, whether that be by employee, by FTE, or a hybrid approach. As I illustrated each of those concepts, the key theme to keep in mind is pretty much anything that you can envision is supported through the Oracle EPM cloud platform. You just have capabilities to configure and tailor the end-to-end enterprise process that best meets the needs of your organization. And there are some considerations to be made around including everybody in the process, so you're minimizing the manual effort it's required to assemble your budgets and forecasts and any estimating activities you have, so that management has real-time view into changing financials and can make appropriate management decisions. So let's take a few minutes to dive deep into the indirect rates model, and we'll be demonstrating that, like I said earlier, using Oracle's EPM cloud platform. Okay. So I'm just going to switch into my browser. As I mentioned earlier, Oracle's solution that we're going to be looking at is cloud-based solution. So I'm simply logging into the website. When I log in, you're presented with this simple interface that looks and feels very much like an application on a tablet. It's by design. It's just some of the components of Oracle's cloud platform. There could be an announcement among other activities any user needs to do. For this purpose, what I have is a process that goes through the various components of the indirect rates model. before I actually get into this model, let me just pull up a quick report so you have a visual to look at. I'm going to give you an overview of what the model really is. And keep in mind, this is just for illustrative purposes. It's an example. The configuration is flexible and could be tailored to whatever needs you have. In this model, we're going to be looking at an indirect rates application that has approximately 1,000 accounts that make up, whether it be the statistical accounts, the basis, or the natural P&L accounts that are leveraged for the calculation of indirect cost or base. This model also has approximately 1,000 org codes, namely in the entity dimension, that roll up into various components of the business that are defined across 7 business segments, and I'll touch upon some of those business segments and how it's used in this calculation. From an indirect rate model perspective, we're going to be looking at 8 fringe pools, 2 of which are intermediate and 6 of which are final and applied throughout the allocation process. We're also going to be looking at how this model supports calculation of 15 service centers. Some are facility-based, others are corporate-driven, such as HR, IT, executive, others. There are 15 overhead pools. Once again, there is the notion of intermediate pools in between, and we'll kind of touch upon some of those concepts as well, and 6 G&A pools. There's also some additional miscellaneous pools in this model that I will briefly scan through. Namely, we have something for subcontracted costs calculated separately and material handling, just more for the purposes of additional analytics and visibility. So let's get right into the application. What I'm demonstrating right now on my screen is a dashboard that summarizes the pool rates for fringe pools, G&A pools, and overhead pools. And if anybody's looking at this screen and they're like, Pritpal, why do you have G&A pool before overhead? It's just for visual presentation purposes. I have more overhead pools here, so I've put them at the bottom, but the waterfall actually does go from fringe to overhead to G&A. If you're able to see, notice that there's actually a set of bar for each of the pools. I'll focus a little bit on the fringe pools, and I'll maximize it to make it a little bit easier. Anything that's represented as blue is a version of the rates, which I've pre-calculated for this demonstration, and another set of bars that's all 0 at the moment and represented in green, which we will actually calculate as we go through this demonstration today. So let me back out again. Another thing I wanted to touch upon real quickly is at the top, notice there's a 3-step process to this model. We have the rates summary, we have the rates planning, and we have the rates administration. So the rate summary is the output of the model. Specifically when you've gone through your calculations, whether that be your monthly forecast process and you want to look at the impact on rates as part of that process, or your annual budgeting process, and then you want to start calculating the rates for provision, all of the outputs at that point in time would come from the rate summary screens. The rates planning screen, I'll switch to it real quickly, is more sort of the building blocks as you're actively going through that planning cycle and calculating. And we'll do a little bit of deep dive in it as well. Rates administration, I'll focus on it a little bit later, but that's your indirect rate structure. So the assignment of organizations to various pools, that happens in the administration. And I'll also talk a little bit about really how we've leveraged best practices from government contracting solutions that specialize in indirect rates and incorporate that in an Oracle EPM solution. So how does this model work? The model works with a few set of assumptions that are fed into it just to start the process. If I will go back to my screens on that PowerPoint, notice how there were different cubes and then there were source systems, namely the GL, that were coming in. This model leverages any actuals that are critical for calculation of forecast rates directly from actuals that are being booked in the general ledger system. Anything that's being built up by project, by labor, or by indirect costs is being built up in the other cubes that we saw earlier. And once again, this model leverages that information directly from those cubes as well. The key is we're not rekeying any information that's already been built in your end-to-end process that we're going to be looking at right now. There's also the ability to bring in different versions of your budget. So if you have For example, I see this very commonly. You have a round of budget that's finalized for cost purposes and another round that goes through with the new org structures. You can certainly have assumptions that are tailored to each of those versions supported in this model as well. Another thing that I'll touch upon, because we're not going to be able to visually see this, is if you have planning for costs at a summarized level of detail. To give you an example, if you have meals and entertainment expense items, a lot of times what ends up being a best practice is you want to be able to plan for that activity as one sum number, but a component of that may be allowable or unallowable for the purpose of calculating the rates. What we can do in that scenario is leverage actuals as a reference for splitting the allowable and unallowable components. I found that to be an effective strategy to quickly support building up the budget in the summarized view, but then also having the appropriate level of detail required for calculation of indirect rates. Once the data is by account and by org, the model uses the rate administration flags. Let's get right into it. So what we're now looking at on the screen is essentially a flat list of every single entity / org in the organization listed on the left. And this is a long flat list, but keep in mind, this is the administration step that happens once when you have a change to a rate model. Another thing I want to highlight is that the version is selectable. So if you have multiple iterations for your budget, which is what we're looking at here, you can certainly support that in the system. Not only can you have multiple iterations of the raw cost, you can actually have multiple different rate structures applied to that raw cost. You can have versions that have the same cost and different rate structures to be able to do what-if analysis. The model simply has the ability to support to not only captures the fringe assumptions, but anything else that you have in your model as well. There's various screens that allow you to assign each org to the pool that it is a component of simply by using true or false flags. And based on the flags, the model then actually calculates the component of the cost base, ultimately the rate, and then applies the allocation. Okay. So let's actually go through a few calculations. As I had shown earlier, we started the model with a dashboard with only round one, which is represented as a reference on the left side of my screen, calculated. I'm actually going to go through a series of clicks to illustrate how this model actually runs the calculations. I'm going to go ahead and just select the fringe calculations. It takes about 2 to 3 seconds. I'll give it a few more just because we're also broadcasting the live webinar here. So notice after I click that, all of my calculations for the fringe have taken place. You can look at it, individually pool by pool. The assumptions are exactly the same because between the two versions, I haven't made any changes yet. If I were to go back to my dashboard and look at my fringe now, notice everything that was calculated for round one has now been calculated for round two as well. So if I wanted to change my assumptions for the fringe, the way you would do it in this demo product is to actually go through the series of assumptions that make up each of those fringe. I'm going to be specifically focusing on one pool, one fringe, I'll call it waterfall, so to speak, where we have one intermediate and subsequent final fringe pools, and change some assumptions so we can see how the model actually calculates between different versions. I'm going to go ahead and change my target fringe percent. And as I'm doing this, I'll quickly speak to why we have the target fringe percent. One of the things I've found in fringe calculations specifically is the timing difference between when HR actually negotiates and finalizes the fringe cost versus when the planning and provisional submission is due. Due to the short timing difference between those cycles, what I've found to be most effective is actually leveraging a target percentage by pool to start the waterfall of the allocation, and then you can always come back and fine-tune the components that make up that total fringe. As I mentioned, the example we're looking at where statutory fringe is actually an intermediate, we will see trickle-down impact in the subsequent pools, so I have to come back and correct any variances. Once again, this is capability that you have in the solution where one thing can build another, and you can very easily leverage any assumptions that have been previously provided in the model. I'm going to appropriately reflect that 10% change. As I'm making this, just make a note that we're making a 10% change in total fringe assumptions. Okay. So simply put, you can have screens that capture indirect rates assumptions, whether that be for fringe. You may even have components that use three-factor formula. In this model, executive residuals are calculated based on three-factor formulas. You may even have adjustments that you can layer in. Now that I've made that, I'm actually going to go back to my previous screen and rerun my fringe calculations. Once again, it takes a few seconds. I have now recalculated just because it's much easier to see. Notice now that we're looking at our fringe pools, there's pool 1, which we've changed, which was intermediate to pool 2, 5, and 7. And each of those, 2, 3, and 7, and each of those have been appropriately adjusted with the assumptions that we made. So as this is happening, I'd like to actually show you what the system did. Even though we're looking at a summary, the system calculates everything by the lowest level of detail that's been brought into the indirect rate models. And keep in mind, I've been kind of reinforcing the notion of capturing everything by account, by org, by lowest level of detail, so that when you need the ability to drill down, you can always drill down. So what I'm looking at now is a statement of indirect rate expenses, specifically for the fringe pools. And notice each of the calculations are done at the bottom level of detail, and any allocations of that cost across the entire indirect rates process is very well defined in these reports. And we'll actually take a look at how we can do more ad hoc analysis even beyond the statement of indirect rate submission. Very simply, I'm going to go back, I'm going to run the calculation for the entire waterfall. And while this is running, I'm actually going to show you what the output of this model looks like. So what I have here is the entire, book is what it's called in the Oracle EPM cloud solution that represents the statement of indirect rate submission. What we've been able to do at each of our clients where we have this indirect rate models is to have fully vetted out processes approved by the internal governance team and then also the indirect rates corporate team, such that this actually becomes your submission directly to your auditors. So beginning with your fringe, and if I scroll down through this list, you'll notice there's a lot of detail that the system has pre-calculated that's critical to the organization. And rather than scrolling through each of these reports, I'm actually going to scroll through the thumbnails on the left to show you how some of these details follow through. Over here, midway through the process, we're looking at how some of the service centers are getting calculated and how the residual components that you may have in the waterfall are being allocated and built up. If I scroll down, there's some additional screens. Here's the support that shows how the executive pieces were allocated out and how the three-factor formula by segment was the basis for allocating that component of it. So, all in all, we're looking at a report package that has 105 reports that represent the entire submission. So extremely powerful, built on the bottoms-up view that you have as you're going through it. I know I have a few minutes remaining, so I'm actually going to switch to SmartView. SmartView is the ad hoc tool that allows you to take anything that you've built in the model and do ad hoc reporting on it. I'm going to briefly spend some time here just to show the power of the model that we just looked at. I'm going to go ahead and refresh. Oh, thankfully I'm still connected. So what I've done is I've queried from this live application that we just demonstrated and pulled back some key results. What I'm looking at is a summary of my costs, or P&L line items, I should say, and in columns, the various pools that represent my indirect rate model. I'm interested in analyzing fringe, so I'm going to go ahead and keep only on just the fringe pools. I want to see how direct labor, specifically my HR set of labor expense, make up my various fringe pools. Through use of mouse click operations, whether that be double left click or double right click, I can zoom in and zoom out from the level of detail that I've set up in my model. I'm going to now just illustrate some concepts here. I'm keeping only on fringe 1, but I'm interested in actually seeing how fringe 1 for total direct labor dollars for HR actually get into my first fringe pool, pool 1. If I would like to do that, I'm just going to go ahead and click on Pivot Total Segment 1, which represents my entity. I get a warning that you're changing the structure of your report. Make sure you want to do that. I click Yes, and then I can drill into my organizations. And I can do analysis such as keep only, and then very quickly get to a point where I'm looking at very, very specific information in my model. And keep in mind, I'm looking at this by year total. I can also run this query by month. So there's a lot of power when you built up this analysis. And I just wanted to quickly demonstrate that. I know we wanted to reserve some time for the Q&A, so I'm actually going to pause here and give Colin the opportunity to bring up any questions that we have from the group.
All right, great. Well, we had a few questions that came in along the way, so let's get right into it.
Sure.
The first question, does the indirect rates model support allocation basis other than dollars from the P&L?
Oh, very good question. So I know I skimmed through this piece of it in my demonstration. A lot of what we looked at today was based off of total direct labor as the base, but other drivers such as square footage, FTE, headcount, and whatever else you may have are certainly supported in the model. We just have to make sure that we have the appropriate statistical accounts, is what we call them, in the model, and then we apply that according to the pool definition so that other things can also be the basis for the allocation. But the answer is yes.
Great. Next question. What is your recommendation for labor planning details? Should they be by employee or FTE? What have you seen from your clients?
So I would strongly recommend to have a process that gives you the ability to build up what you need from a financial standpoint as quickly as possible. So you're not spending weeks at times just building up a project plan. What we find is, depending on the maturity of the process and the discipline in the organization, a hybrid approach works best. And the reason for a hybrid approach is because it gives you the best of both worlds, where you have the discipline and the information to build up the detail by individual employee. You have the ability to do so, and where you don't, you can leverage more of an FTE-based model to quickly build up those assumptions. So my recommendation has always been to adopt a hybrid approach because it's the best of both worlds.
Okay, and the last question we'll take here is, can you use this system for sales planning?
Depends on what you mean by sales planning. If you're referring to being able to use this tool to quickly, analyze the financial output from a bidding and proposal activity standpoint, absolutely. But would this replace your legal sales system that is used for capturing, the contracts and the negotiated details that go with the contract? No, but what we've found in the past is that you can always leverage the important information from your sales tool and integrate that into this model so that you don't have to necessarily go through the duplicated effort of capturing the attributes that do drive your financials. So it depends is my answer, but at a very minimum, you can leverage existing sales tools to start the financial calculations in your model.
Great. Well, thanks, Pritpal. That's all the time that we have for today. We really appreciate everyone joining us this afternoon. Please be on the lookout for a recorded version of today's presentation. And if you have any final questions, we have Pritpal's contact information live on the screen now, so feel free to reach out via email or phone, and he'd be happy to connect directly. On behalf of all of us at SC&H Group, thanks, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, everyone.